Well, we're done with the streetcars and interurbans, and we're back on Military Street, and this is Griswold Street looking south. This is what it looks like today. But at one time, it looked like this. It was a beautiful residential area. You can see the streetcar tracks going down the center of it. And as the streetcars came into vogue and the automobile, folks were building their homes further out from the city. But from Griswold Street south on Military Street, this is where the movers and shakers had homes. And some of those homes were quite beautiful. And look at the trees there. In this postcard here, you can see Military Street looking north with the river on the right. And as you zoom in here, you can see this carriage as well. So I imagine this was the late 1800s, perhaps early 1900s. In this postcard here, we're looking out over the St. Clair River, and we can see an excursion boat going upstream to Port Huron, and this particular steamboat is the city of Toledo. Here you can see a dock in Port Huron at the White Star Dock, which was at the foot of Grand River Avenue, or Butler Street back then. But we're not here to look at ships today. We want to look at some of the homes that were on Military Street and are still there, or some of them are still there on Military Street, and we want to look at those and perhaps find out a little bit about the people who lived in those homes. We've already looked at these homes. These were north of Griswold Street. But looking south, we don't have to go very far. You can see here on the right-hand side this home here. This home is quite different than a lot of the homes you see back in the 1800s, early 1900s, the Victorian-style home. I'm not an architect, but this seems to be like a Greek revival type of architecture. Very beautiful, nicely restored. This same home was featured in a booklet entitled Port Huron in 1900. And you can see what it looked like back then in this photograph here. This home belonged to Dr. Frederick Wilsdorfer, which he was a prominent physician and a surgeon in Port Huron at the time. Prior to living here, he lived in the 1300 block of Military, but in 1906, according to this medical journal, he got married. He married Marion Williams of St. Thomas, Ontario on October 30th of that year. Dr. Losdorfer passed away in 1941 at the age of 77. And for years afterwards, the house was occupied by his widow, and at least until 1960s, I believe. And perhaps still is occupied by part of that family. I really don't know. I always think it's neat when you can have photographs of a home taken over 100 years apart, that you can compare them and see what they looked like back then and today. And in all honesty, this house looks as good today as it did back then, if not better. So that certainly is a plus for Port Huron. The house right next door also has a neat history. It was owned by a couple different prominent businessmen, the first being Frank Peavy. Peavy worked for the Upton Manufacturer Company in Battle Creek as a bookkeeper. In 1884, this company moved their plant to Port Huron, and Mr. Peavy continuing on with them. In 1890, the Upton Manufacturing Company was merged into the Port Huron Engine and Thresher Company, and Mr. Peavy was made general manager of the business. The other prominent businessman that lived in this home was Frank D. Jinks. He was the secretary-treasurer of Jinks, Taylor, Howard and Company, which was a lumber company. He was the secretary and treasurer of the Port Huron Lumber Company. He was president of Jinks Wade Company, which was a cement company. And he was president of the Port Huron and Duluth Steamship Company. It looks like there was only 2 steamers in this company. He was also a co-owner of this ship you're looking at here, named the Mineral Rock, which was a freighter in the late 1800s. It later became a barge and burned at the dock in 1896. So he was quite a prominent businessman. And later on he would do other things as well. He lived here, and if you remember your history in these videos, he also lived in the 1400 block that we looked at earlier. He lived beside William Jenks in that block. Later on, he lived in the 1800 block of Military Street, and at his death, he lived in the 1900 block of Military Street, and that's where his widow lived as well. So it would seem Mr. Jinks didn't mind moving, but he seemed to like Military Street quite well. He had 4 different homes at 4 different times in Port Huron on Military. And we'll look at a couple of those homes a little bit later. As we go a few doors down into the 1700 block, we come to this home, which is commonly known as the Davison home. That would be Wilbur Davison, not to be confused with this home here that belongs to, or did belong to, James Davison over on 7th Street in Walton. We'll look at this home in a different video. This is what the Davison home looks like today, and this is what it looked like back in 1900. Pretty much the same, actually. This is a photograph of Wilbur Davison. You can see from this caption below his photograph here that he was quite a successful businessman. He was president of Aikman Bakery Company, president of the Flint Pannon Company, secretary and treasurer of Port Huron Light and Power Company, and director of the Commercial Bank. Mr. Davidson's claim to fame is that he is credited to bringing the first electric light into Port Huron. The year was 1883. It had been less than 20 years since the end of the Civil War, and Wilbur Davison was having a great year in 1883 at his dry goods store on the Opera House block of Military Street. Actually, it was right across the street from the Opera House. Today, that block looks like this here, and you can still see some of the original buildings a little bit further down, but the one with all the new brick, that was where the Davidson store was, Davidson Measle at the time. And either they've torn that store down or they've completely covered the front with new brick, because that's not the same as what's in this picture. But the other buildings are. As every successful businessman does, always thinking about how am I going to get more customers, Davidson came up with an idea that would make P.T. Barnum envious. It had only been 1 year since Tom Edison had succeeded in bringing his dynamo online in the Pearl Street station in New York City to provide a source for his first electrical distribution center. He had plans for street lighting, transportation, and all kinds of appliances. Davidson had eagerly read the accounts of the sensation in New York and wondered what effect the electric light could have on the city of Port Huron, and his dry goods store, of course. He set a goal to have his store lighted electrically in time for a big Christmas celebration. By the fall of 1883, he had installed an electric generator, or dynamo, powered by a small steam engine in the basement of his store. The first time the switch was thrown, the lights refused to flicker to life. Davidson and his engineers believed that the motor was too small to produce the speed they needed. He promptly sent the engine back to its makers to be replaced by a larger model. James Thompson and his son James Jr. were the millwrights that set up the new system and were discouraged when it still failed to light the store. Thompson studied all the meager literature available on the fledgling industry, and after Davidson agreed to accept responsibility for the dynamo if Thompson tinkered with the system. But he soon had the lights flickering and then brightly glowing. At that time, the available lights were of 2 types, the incandescent bulb that Thomas A. Edison was famous for, and the arc light. The arc light was an earlier development that was similar to a welder's arc in construction, thus being very brilliant but inefficient, hot, and of best use later as streetlights where it would be outdoors and high on a pole. But these were the lights that Davidson chose to initially light his business. When the lights were turned on, they were much brighter than the old gas lamps were and had kind of a purplish hue to it. And it must have seemed kind of exciting and maybe just a little bit weird when the customers came in and saw everything there with kind of a purple hue around the store. But I think it would have been pretty neat to see that. Once everything was in place, a little advertisement was in order. The Port Huron Daily Times said this, November 19, 1883. W.F. Davidson and Company, the Opera House dry goods dealer, are about to introduce the Edison electric light in their store and invite the public to call and buy something as a souvenir of the first electric light in Port Huron. Their advertisement appears in tonight's Times. And here is that advertisement. You probably can't quite make out what it says on the bottom, but it says, "Our store to have the Edison light. We claim the credit of securing to Port Huron this great enterprise. Be sure you buy something as a souvenir of the first electric light in our city." I like that. Buy a souvenir from us. And then at the very bottom it says, "That little store." So that must have been what it was known as. The second newspaper article appeared about a month later in the Times, December 20th, 1883. It says this: "The firm of W.F. Davidson and Company in the Opera Block is entitled to the credit of introducing the first electric light into Port Huron, the first exhibition of it having been made in their store on Wednesday evening. The power is supplied by a neat and compact 3-horsepower engine supplied with steam from an upright boiler, which is just sufficient to run the dynamo and feed 3 arc lights. The lamps furnished by the company are compact and handsome. They have been placed in the Davidson and Company store that the entire interior, as well as the walk and street in front of the building, are evenly and brilliantly illuminated. The 2 lamps inside the store have opal shades, which tone down the extreme brilliancy of the light and diffuse it in all directions, while the one in front of the store is enclosed in a clear glass globe. The trial Wednesday evening was a complete success, and the brilliant light attracted a crowd of admiring observers, both inside and outside the store." And it goes on to talk a little bit about the manager. And then toward the end here, it says, "Its first test in Port Huron having been so successful, we hope that it may continue to give as good satisfaction in regular use, and that a company may be organized here to introduce the light generally." The marketing advantages of commercial electric lighting was obvious to neighboring merchants as well. As they watched customers parade in and out of Davidson's store, they too wanted to replace their gas lights with the new electric lights. Davidson installed a larger machine, ran wiring into the adjoining store, operated by the Balmer Brothers, which was a grocery store, and added 7 incandescent lights in his window. Davidson had demonstrated the value of electric light and now proceeded to interest 2 other prominent Port Huron businessmen in forming a company. These men were Henry McMorrin and Charles F. Harrington. Between the 3 of them, they became the driving force behind an enterprise that was on the cutting edge of a fledgling industry. In this excerpt from the Daily Times, dated March 1st, 1884, it says this: "The company will petition the Common Council for permission to run their wires through the streets, and will also propose to furnish the city with 7 street lights on poles 30 feet high, in exchange for steam from boilers at the waterworks to run their engine." So there was a little bartering going on there. Thus came into being Port Huron's first electrical utility, the Excelsior Electric Company of Port Huron, incorporated February 29, 1884. It was the first electric utility in St. Clair County and one of the first in the United States. It would not be until 1886 that the city of Detroit would see the Edison Illuminating Company incorporated. And the man that brought these electric lights to Port Huron lived in this house here. Other people lived in it, but it will always be known as the Davidson House. Join me for my next video, and we'll continue walking down Military Street and seeing who lives in these homes from yesteryear.